Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the nature and the power of tragedy in drama, and in particular we'll be looking at King Lear, which is widely regarded by critics as perhaps the greatest tragedy, even the greatest work of art ever written. With me is James P. Driscoll, who is one of the foremost interpreters of Renaissance literature from a Jungian perspective. He is the author of Identity in Shakespearean Drama and also The Unfolding God of Jung and Milton. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. Let's begin by talking about tragedy in general. I think it's generally the case that students of Renaissance literature, in fact probably all literature, regard tragedy as the highest literary art form.
Yes, it's generally regarded as the greatest and art form, the most difficult to do. Certainly there are very few good tragedies, and it's something that's very peculiar to the Western world, and I suppose Western civilization. It has certain components. Real tragedy does. You have to have a great man or a great person. There has to be a flaw, and the flaw in the greatness. There has to be some disastrous mistake, some excess usually associated with pride, and that brings about a fall. And it produces a certain purgation, is the term frequently applied to it. But King Lear is generally considered the greatest tragedy, or at least the purest tragedy. That doesn't necessarily mean that everyone would agree, for example, that it is Shakespeare's greatest play. Many think that Hamlet is his greatest play, but they don't necessarily, they would still say that King Lear is the greatest tragedy, period. And so it's the purest tragedy in a way. It's a totally phenomenal work. I remember recently seeing something whereby certain leading businessmen, Buffett, Gates, and Steve Jobs, were asked to list their favorite works, their favorite books. And Buffett and Gates listed business books. Jobs listed, I think he was asked for 3, and it was something like King Lear, and King Lear, or maybe it was King Lear, and Moby Dick, which is very similar. It's kind of a novelization of a lot of the basic things in King Lear. And I found that very interesting, that he would perceive it, but he's totally in line with what nearly all the greatest critics throughout the last several hundred years have thought. I remember another one is Dr. Samuel Johnson, and Samuel Johnson was so moved and so upset by King Lear that he couldn't look at the book again until he was required to do so because he contracted to do an edition of Shakespeare, and so he had to deal with it again.
Samuel Johnson, the great dictionary writer.
Yeah, one of the great men of letters of all time.
Mm-hmm. So the question that many viewers are naturally going to be thinking is, why are tragedies considered such great works of art as opposed to romances or comedies or histories?
That's a good question, but it's rather difficult to answer, other than to say that they're much more difficult to write successfully, and they deal with philosophical problems and issues more profoundly, it's thought, than do comedies and romances. Mm-hmm. It's also part of the West that there's a tragedy is obviously very important in Greek culture. The Greeks invented tragedy. They considered their tragic writers to be their greatest writers, outside of Homer, of course, was early and an epic. Aristotle wrote on tragedy, but it was picked up further, really, by the fact that there always appears to be something tragic about the basic myth of Christianity. Jesus dying on the cross.
And in fact, the myth of the dying God is much older than Christianity itself. You can find it in Egypt, you can find it in Samaria.
Yes, and that's part of the power of Christianity, part of an explanation of why it found a receptive culture in which to spread. Mm-hmm. Now, in my view of King Lear is that it does tap in to crucial Christian and Judeo-Christian mythical concepts and structures.
Before we go into that, and of course we do want to cover that in some detail, let me just reflect back to you my own thinking about tragedy, which is largely something that developed in earlier conversations that you and I have had. I should mention for the benefit of our viewers that we were college roommates back in 1968 when I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin. So we've had many discussions about this. And one of the points that you raised that stuck with me, Jim, is that the reason that tragedies are so important, so powerful, is because in the great tragedies, what you see is the ennoblement of the human spirit in the face of a disaster.
Yes, that's very important. It's a triumph of the human spirit in the face of disaster, or in the face of the destruction of the individual hero. And the greatness of the tragic hero is affirmed, along with, of course, his flaws, but we usually have a stronger impression of the greatness of the hero than we do of the flaws.
And I think philosophically speaking, tragedies are important because it's not glossing over the dark side of life, as so many religions, for example, often tend to do.
Right. The religions have difficulty accommodating tragedy, and one of the big issues with King Lear is that it does not have a happy ending. There is no redemption. Cordelia is seen as a Christ figure, but she's dead at the end. And Lear says, "Thou come no more, never, 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 never."
Some not say, about to get resurrected.
Right. There's no indication of resurrection, nor she's floating up in the clouds to St. Peter, or anything like else. It's the finality of death. Mm-hmm.
Which is, in a way, very profound.
Yes, and there's a profound injustice, too, because she's killed. She's an innocent kill, the person doing the right things, and she's nonetheless snuffed out. And there's no redemption in King Lear, although when I was studying these things, and when the critics were writing back in the 50s and 60s, that was the big issue. Is there any redemption in King Lear? And some people had difficulty accepting the idea that there wasn't. Others, I remember there were some powerful essays. One was by someone named Judah Stamfer, who I think went back through family to the Holocaust and so on. So it was kind of tied in at that time to ideas and feelings about the Holocaust, this question of
in other words,
justice in the universe.
Evil can prevail in a tragedy.
Yes, yeah. Evil can prevail, but it doesn't destroy human dignity. Human dignity triumphs, though justice does not triumph necessarily, and life does not necessarily triumph, but human dignity, the human spirit, triumphs. And in King Lear, one would say that love triumphs, and the truth triumphs as well.
And I know your perspective as a Jungian critic is that the great tragedies, and in particular King Lear, give us glimpses into the nature of the godhead.
Yes, that's true. And this is particularly true of King Lear. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so powerful, particularly to readers brought up in the Judeo-Christian tradition. By my interpretation, Lear goes through certain stages which are prefigured or discussed in Jung's answer to Job. And he starts out as a figure like Yahweh. And Jung presents Yahweh in answer to Job as this primitive type of consciousness that's rather amoral and intemperate. And his view is that Yahweh, in effect, dies on the cross to compensate for the sins, for his own sins against Job and against mankind, rather than dying on the cross to pay the penalty for man's sins against him. It really makes, though it's much criticized, it really makes God a much more noble figure than the Christian view, though I don't know that that's been noted at all. It also makes God tragic. Now, what I see happening in King Lear is that he starts out as a figure very much like Jung's Yahweh, very intemperate, anger, unreflecting, lacking in self-knowledge, going from one extreme to another.
Let me interrupt you just for a second, though, because you've referenced Jung's book, Answer to Job, and I think it's worth mentioning since it's a little book and sometimes considered rather obscure, but many critics believe it's Jung's greatest work.
Jungian critics believe that, yes. And those who knew Jung well, I think, believe that. Jung himself appears to have believed that. And he saw himself there as achieving, shall we say, a signal insight into the nature of Godhead. And that's why he thought it was uniquely important. Now, my view is that that insight is actually present very clearly and in a way more as interestingly developed in our greatest tragedy, King Lear, as it is in Answer to Job. And as I was saying, Lear starts out with this figure like Yahweh, and then he becomes a figure like Job. If you remember the story, he gives all to his two evil daughters, rejects the good daughter who wants to tell him the truth, and the evil daughters betray him, throw him out into the storm, and he suffers like Job. He loses everything and suffers madness. There's references to the sea monster there, which of course that's Leviathan, and it echoes the book of Job in the Bible. So he goes through this stage of being suffering and being like Job.
Yeah. Now, in Job's case, it was innocent suffering, and in the case of King Lear, the suffering was really due to his own poor judgment.
Yes, and that makes him more like Yahweh, of course.
Yeah.
But at the end, Lear moves beyond the Yahweh stage, or beyond the Job stage of he calling for patience, like he said, patience I need, when he's in the Job stage, which of course Job is this figure of patience. But he doesn't find the patience, and in the end he completely losing it because he's defiant.
He goes mad, actually, doesn't he, out in the storm?
Yeah, he goes mad. He curses the heavens for providing no justice. He goes mad out in the storm, but in a way he becomes both mad and completely clear at the very end, because at the very end, Cordelia is brought in, and she's been killed.
The true loving daughter. He finally recognizes her for who she is.
Yeah, and she's been struggling to restore him against the evil daughters. Well, she comes in, and it's just her dead body, and he howls against the heavens, their terrible injustice, and he becomes a Promethean figure. And there are allusions there to Prometheus.
In other words, challenging the ruling deity.
Yes, on the behalf of mankind, and on behalf of mankind's need for justice and desire for justice. And so he goes through the three stages. He starts out as a figure like Yahweh, becomes a figure like Job, and at the end becomes a figure like Prometheus.
Now, and the stage of madness that occurs between the Job phase and the Prometheus phase, I think, is also important, because it's in madness that he gets in touch with, a little more in touch with his true nature.
Yes, that's true. He gets in touch with what he calls the bare-forked animal. And he's out in the storm. He has Edgar there that is
loyal,
but partially naked, and he's ripping off his clothes and so on. And he talks about the bare-forked animal, mankind.
Which is important, because, I think human culture, human civilization, in many ways is designed to protect us from the realization that we are, in fact, animals.
Yes, that's true, and he has to face the animal nature that we have out there in the storm, on the heath, and the most important way in which we're like animals is, like animals, we die. And he says, why should a dog, cat, or a rat have life and thou no breath at all, when he's confronted with the daughter of his Cordelia's dead body? And that's the most important thing about life, other than life itself, is that it ends in death, and we share that with the animals.
And at the same time, as we have this animal nature, there's this other part of ourselves, a more noble part.
Yes. And he has a kind of nobility when he enters this Promethean stage of not willing to compromise any truth. I mean, King Lear is a play that's about truth and love, and Cordelia is thrown out because she tells him the truth. He wants to be flattered. She tells him the truth. And one of the major points of the play is that truth and love go together, and you don't really love if you're not telling the truth. If you're flattering and manipulating people, that's not love. Love is telling them the truth.
Because what she tells him, when he asks her, how much do you love me? The other evil daughters are flattering him, and she says, I love you as a daughter should.
Right.
That's the truth.
Yes. So she's very truthful, and instead of resenting in any way being thrown out, she doesn't. She comes to his aid with her husband, with an army, and they're defeated in battle, and she's killed. But there's no expression of resentment, or that Lear recognizes that she was very wronged, but she never complains that she was wrong. In fact, just the opposite. But you move through these three stages, and there's really a fourth stage of the Godhead, and I've said that the play shows the faces of God. And the fourth stage is Cordelia herself. And so Jung was looking for these figures in the Godhead, and he had Yahweh at the start, and he had Christ and Satan, and then he didn't have a feminine. We've discussed this before. And
we have an interview on the nature of the Godhead archetype.
And so he looked to the Virgin Mary.
Yeah.
And what I've written in another book is that, no, that's not the place to look. That's a primitive archetype like Yahweh himself, the mother and the father. It's the wise old woman archetype, or Sophia. And Cordelia is at that stage. And that's, as I said before, you start out with Yahweh, you have Christ and Satan, but it's not Christ and Satan, King Lear. It's really Job and Prometheus, which are in those places, though there's differences. And
in other words, you're saying different characters can represent the same archetype.
Of course. And they shed different types of light on the same archetype. And at the top of the schema, of course, is the wise woman. Cordelia's not old, but she represents wisdom, Sophia, and that is the fourth figure of the Godhead. So my view is that King Lear presents the four figures of the Godhead that Jung is sort of grasping towards, and it presents them in a way of a kind of clarity and power that has no equals or anything approaches it in anything else in Western literature. We do have other great works that deal with these sorts of profound theological questions, such as Moby Dick, which is rather similar to King Lear, and it's more like Ahab is a combination of Yahweh and Prometheus. We also have Dostoevsky and the Grand Inquisitor and all the things we have in the Brothers Karamazov, but they're really presented, these essential issues of the nature of the Godhead are presented with greater clarity and power in King Lear than anywhere else. And that is saying a lot, because this, I've just named three of our very greatest works, two of the absolutely greatest novels ever written, and then King Lear. King Lear has advantages over a novel in that it is novel sprawls and it's epical and so on, and a play has to be much more concise and defined and contained. It can't go off in the kinds of directions that Moby Dick and the Brothers Karamazov go off in. Fewer words, that's right. And the audience gets restless after 3 hours, so it's got to be contained in time.
Well, there are critics who believe that King Lear is, as we pointed out earlier, the greatest work of literature ever written in any language.
Yes, that's true. And for example, one of perhaps the greatest critic of our current time, the last 50 years, is probably Harold Bloom. And that's his view. He has an idea of the Western canon, and sort of stratifies, and he puts Shakespeare at the very top, and at the top of Shakespeare, of course, is King Lear.
Well, and many people wouldn't suspect, as you do, that a work of literature from a secular writer like Shakespeare is actually opening up a window into the nature of the Godhead.
I suppose they wouldn't, but you have to look at King Lear more as a revelation, in the sense that the books of the Bible were revelations. And one way of looking at the whole thing is, we say, these were inspired, Psalms and Job and Isaiah and the book of Revelation and the Gospels were all inspired by God in an ongoing revelation, and then it stops. We have a council in 300 AD or so, decides, well, these are the books, and that's it. But what Bloom is sort of saying, and what I think is the case, is that this kind of revelations of the truth of the Western tradition is ongoing. And in a way, the brothers Karamazov and Moby Dick and Milton's Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno, and above all, King Lear, should be as much a part of this this revelation as the Bible and the Homeric epics and so on. Mm-hmm. It doesn't exactly make sense to make a cutoff and saying, well, this is the inspired myths of the culture, but this isn't. This is just what Moby Dick and King Lear are just what some writer wrote. Well, Isaiah is just some writer too.
In other words, what you're saying is that a poet has as much valid insight into the nature of the deity, the nature of reality, as a prophet.
Yes, the poets and prophets both tap into the unconscious. Jung was very aware of that. And they're looking for things that compensate the inadequacies in their culture. In other words, they're looking for things that teach their culture something. Teach them which directions they should be going, and reveal something to the culture. And it's not necessarily a conscious thing, whereas when a theological writer writes, he has a certain tablet that he's following, a certain set of beliefs and a plan that he wants to prove to be true.
To lay it all out logically.
Right, to lay it all out logically. He's explaining what Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and Melville and so on are doing is they are revealing. They're almost well, you know how a prophet acts like at Delphi. The Spirit of the God comes down and he speaks. Well, that's, in a way, that's what's going on with some of these great writers when they take up these kinds of themes.
James P. Driscoll, it's been a real pleasure and eye-opener to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for being with me.
You're welcome, and I hope that the audience enjoys it as you appear to have done.
Yeah. No, I think it's been an enlightening conversation, and thank you for being with us.